Welcome everyone to the Week 7 Waiver Wire show presented by the 33rd team. I am your host as always, Josh Larky, joined as always by my co-host Ryan Reynolds. Week 7 is a big one because first up we have 6 teams on bye, so getting these waiver decisions is extra important. The Cincinnati Bengals, Dallas Cowboys, New York Jets, Carolina Panthers, Houston Texans, and Tennessee Titans are all missing Week 7 due to the bye. Let's talk about some injury fallout from Week 6. Christian McCaffrey has an oblique injury. Kyle Shanahan, when asked about McCaffrey's timetable, said that he actually does not know. He kind of was more forthcoming about how Deebo Samuel did not have a serious injury. I think McCaffrey probably misses anywhere from 1 to 3 games. It doesn't seem like it's an IR type injury, but those thinking he won't miss any time, Shanahan's comments certainly did not suggest that. The two guys to consider here are Jordan Mason and Elijah Mitchell. Ryan, here's how I'm seeing it, and then I kind of want to see how you're viewing it. I think Jordan Mason's probably the guy. And what I mean by that is he had twice as many snaps last week as Elijah Mitchell, twice as many carries, ran twice as many routes. It is clear that he is currently ahead of him in the pecking order. That being said, my lean in this situation, because I don't think McCaffrey misses that much time, is I'd rather grab Mitchell for only a couple percent of my fab, since 1, the injury is probably short term, and 2, Mitchell's the more explosive player. I think if either of these guys has 2 20-point weeks, it's Mitchell, not Jordan Mason. I think if Jordan Mason kind of like a Gus Edwards plotting type, more so than a dynamic athlete. How are you viewing this one? Since I think people are going to spend 10 to 15% of their fab at least on Mason.
Yeah, I see it the same way in the sense that I prefer Mitchell too, but I do think what Shanahan's going to do is he's going to go back to his pre-CMC running back deployments a bit, where a bit of the ride the hot hand situation. Both guys play. You know, Mason's looked good in recent weeks in his limited opportunities, so I think he probably gets first crack like you suggested. But if Elijah Mitchell out carried Mason this week, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, actually.
As we mentioned before, Deebo has a shoulder injury. It looks very, very minor. Maybe a 1-week rental for Juwan Jennings and Ray McLeod. I'm not interested in either of those players. Do you have any interest in either? I think looks to me like whoever's in there is going to get 2 to 3 targets.
Yeah, I don't think Jennings' role is going to change much, and oddly enough, I think McLeod's more of a direct backup to Deebo Samuel. I don't want to say they have similar skill sets because that's not quite the reality of the situation, but he seems to fit into more of those yak type plays. That said, I don't really have much fantasy interest in either 49er receiver.
All right, let's talk about something more exciting now. We've kind of talked like, oh, these are not the waiver pickups we like. I think we're more interested actually in this Rams backfield. Kyron Williams has an ankle sprain. He's already been ruled out for week 7. I'd say he's going to miss anywhere from week 7 through the next 2 to 3 weeks as well after that. And then backup Ronnie Rivers has a sprained PCL, so another knee injury. The timetable that I've read is 4 to 5 weeks on that. This opens up immediate and potential long-term opportunity for Zach Evans and Royce Freeman. Zach Evans is a skilled grinder back. Incredible advanced rushing metrics throughout college. Never a massive workload. Frequently was getting injured. Absolute zero in the passing game in college. Royce Freeman, this is a player that I don't know about you, Ryan. I actually really was a Royce Freeman guy at one point back in the day. Philip Lindsay, that one really hurt when he won the starting job for the Broncos. I thought 3rd round pick Royce Freeman would be the guy. He's 220 pounds. He had a decent rushing profile in college. He was a very skilled receiver in college, especially for his size as well. And I think this is maybe like a Mason Mitchell situation. I think Zach Evans outscores Royce Freeman. But I think if there's one guy that could give you a crazy spike week, I'm more inclined to think it's Royce Freeman. That being said, we like the Rams offense, and Kyron Williams has felt miscast all year as an ultra bell cow. So I don't think it's out of the question that they just force receiving onto Zach Evans if they think he's the better player. I think I'd go up to 15% on Zach Evans, and I think 5% could probably win you Royce Freeman, and that would be my slightly preferred move. How are you thinking about this one?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I'm trying to get Royce Freeman cheap myself. The one thing I'll say here about this is the Rams seem to be targeting smart football players, and Royce Freeman, I was a Royce Freeman guy too. I can't say he's similar to Kyron Williams because of the size difference, but, you know, fluid athlete, smart player, just like Kyron Williams. I think Evans has more upside, but it wouldn't surprise me, especially, you know, considering that the Rams are going to be playing some pretty good pass rushes in the next few weeks. If Royce Freeman saw more reps than we were expecting.
And then the last big injury to discuss is David Montgomery has a rib injury. He's probably going to miss 1 to 2 weeks. One thing that's always been true with Money Montgomery throughout his career is he seems to suffer horrific injuries every season, and then he misses 1 to 3 games. So I don't expect him to miss more than 1 to 2 games with this rib injury. That opens up an immediate role for Craig Reynolds. I think he's probably in a borderline David Montgomery role. I'm not quite sure if Jahmyr Gibbs returns this week from the hamstring injury. It's been very, very quiet on that front. I think whether or not Gibbs returns, though, I think Craig Reynolds should get a good amount of work. The 1 week that we saw Montgomery out earlier this year, they just gave Jahmyr Gibbs every single up-the-middle carry, and he wasn't nearly as effective as he's been in the other games when he was getting fewer touches, much more in space. I like to think that Craig Reynolds gets this role and that he's going to have the red zone touches. But I think making bids on him, we should be aware that there's a chance that Gibbs returns this week and Reynolds gets 4 touches. But I think most likely we're getting 12 to 15 carries in a good offense with the red zone workload from Reynolds. How high are you thinking you'd go on the fab meter with him in a deeper league?
It's the same situation for me. If I had Montgomery, maybe I'm willing to be a little bit more aggressive, maybe go up 6-8%. But in general, I'm not looking to pay a whole lot. I see the situation pretty much exactly the same way.
Let's talk about some other top running back and receiver ads. Jeff Wilson probably returns in week 7. I think he was limited in practice last week, and they just didn't activate him from injured reserve. Devon Achane's on injured reserve. Raheem Mostert was an absolute bell cow last week. He was the highest scoring running back in fantasy. And that's good news for Jeff Wilson because last year he was the 1A to Mostert's 1B in slightly more than half of their overlapping games last season. High-end fantasy RB2 potential, even if he's splitting with Mostert. And if for some reason something happens to Mostert or he is just the lead back, well, we just saw Mostert as, again, the number 1 scoring running back in fantasy for a week. I'd be willing to go up to 30 to 40% personally if I need a running back with Wilson, given that it's a pretty historic offense. And we've already been spending a lot of our fab this year on guys like Jerome Ford, Devon Achane, stuff like that. So I think if you have some fab left, I think 30 to 40% of your budget's actually where I'd be willing to go if needed for Wilson. How are you seeing this one?
Yeah, I think as needed is the key there. For a lot of my teams where I don't really need a plug-and-play running back, I'm probably looking to make a crooked number in the 20s, 22%, 23%, 27%. If I'm in a bad situation, though, I'm willing to be more aggressive as well because, given Raheem Mostert's injury history, I want to insure him whenever I can. And Wilson's shown that he can be productive in this offense last year and in San Francisco as well. So I'd actually say out of all of these injury situation running backs, and I'm the most interested in Wilson.
Yeah, I'd agree there. I think so far I'd go Wilson and then Zach Evans. Is that how you'd see it in terms of the top 2 right now?
Yeah, we're looking for difference makers. We're chasing upside. So yeah, I'd have Evans second as well.
Let's talk about Chuba Hubbard. He is on week 7 bye, and I think that's exactly why we should be trying to get him for cheap. He was an absolute bell cow this past week, 19 carries, 88 rushing yards, a touchdown. He also ran 27 routes. That was top 10 on the week at the position. He's looked better than Miles Sanders at times this year. And Ryan, I'm going to pass this to you. Talk about the Panthers' schedule after their bye, because I think that should give us more reason for optimism with this offense. And also, Miles Sanders, massive lower body injury history as well.
Yeah, I know we faded Miles Sanders. We viewed him as a product of Philly's offensive line and their offense for the most part. It's not really a huge surprise that Hubbard's roles increase as the year's gone on. But, like you said, Josh, the schedule, let me frame it to you guys this way. Leading into the season, when I was talking about offensive rookie of the year candidates, I had no interest in Bryce Young until their week 7 bye because of their schedule. A 1-5 record was what I projected during that span. They've gone 0-6. Much better times are coming in the second half. I'm not saying that the Panthers are going to be an elite offense, but they're probably going to win some games. They're probably going to actually see some neutral and positive game scripts in the next few weeks once they get off their bye. So I'm interested in Hubbard as well whenever he's available.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Nobody really talks about football the way that Ryan does. I think if you're listening, you'd probably agree. I would assume if you're listening to this show, you agree. So not only should you follow him on Twitter, but check out all his work on the 33rdteam.com. It's free. He has power rankings that just hit the site. Detroit faithful, your time has come. The Lions officially in the top 5. Jets cracked the top 15. A lot of exciting movers there. The Bills fell out of the top 5 after a very head-scratching game against the Giants on primetime. Not only does he have the power rankings, but he'll write up every single team. So he's ranking them and then writing up quick thoughts so you can understand how he's viewing them. That's very key for anyone that wants to follow the NFL, that wants to do any against the spread type betting. Power rankings are super key for things like that. Thursday, he will have his expert picks and predictions for every game on the site. I'd recommend checking those out if you want to know how Ryan's viewing every single game. Saturdays, he drops his actual, like, what he's going to be betting on for each game. So a nice little schedule there for all of Ryan's content. And a nice little showing from one Keontae Ingram. He led the team this past week with 10 carries in James Conner's absence. He had both of the red zone carries. He led Arizona running backs in targets with 2. That doesn't sound that exciting, but he ran a lot fewer routes than Amari DiMercado. DiMercado's probably going to remain the pass down back, but that can always change. It's not like DiMercado has any kind of long leash, given that he's an undrafted free agent from 2023. So Ingram's a player that I know I liked coming out of college. We didn't see much from him last year, but I think it was positive that he ended up leading this backfield in both carries and targets with James Conner's absence. There's room for this role to grow. And again, the Cardinals offense has just been slightly more functioning than I think we expect. Anything to add here to Keontae Ingram? And do you have any interest in Damian Williams, who sneakily had 8 carries to Ingram's 10 this past week?
In general, I think this is a backfield that I'm trying to avoid. I'm definitely not looking to overpay for anyone. Williams, if I'm in a super deep league, maybe I try to get him for one fat buck or so. Ingram, I think a maximum of 8% if I'm in dire straits at running back. But for most of my teams, I'm just passing on him in general.
Yeah, I was going to throw out the number 5 with Ingram. So we're on a similar page there. Let's talk about Josh Downs. He now has at least 5 receptions and 13 fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games. Looks like he'll have Gardner Minshew at quarterback rest of season, which is very good for someone like Josh Downs, who's a lower depth of target player. He's going to need to get there on volume. Gardner Minshew will give the passing volume that Anthony Richardson probably wouldn't. Looks like Richardson will miss the remainder of this season with shoulder surgery. This has to be one of the most tantalizing rookie seasons that I can imagine in terms of what we saw and thinking, I want to see more, and then not getting any more. I don't know if you have anyone in recent memory. Like the next closest would be Sean Watson. Maybe Watson's a little more. Yeah. I think it's him and Watson, because Watson tore his ACL in his 7th game as a rookie. And I think this is sort of comparable, where takes the fantasy world by storm. You immediately see how this guy can be a top 10 NFL quarterback, and then he's gone too soon from his rookie year. Anything to add here on Josh Downs?
No, that's a great parallel. I'm a Josh Downs guy. He's my, kind of skill set. Gardner Minshew is definitely a positive for him because, like you said, Josh, he's a volume guy. He's a PPR guy in general, too, and a half PPR. I'm much less interested. I have Downs on a number of my teams, slated as a bye week fill-in, more or less.
Yeah, he will be moving up my rest of season fantasy rankings. He'll be ranked relatively aggressively this week as well for season long, given that Alec Pierce is also now dealing with a shoulder injury. And if you want to see my fantasy rankings, they'll hit the33rdteam.com later today, Tuesday, for free. And then tomorrow, my rest of season rankings and the trade value chart will be out. And we have a nice, gorgeous looking graphic for that trade value chart. You asked, we answered. So that will be coming very soon from our own Zach Cordaji. Let's turn to Jameson Williams. We're both JMO guys. Week 5, it was tough to be a JMO guy. He had 15 routes run. Nothing happened. They cut his routes back. They scale him back to only 9 routes in week 6, but 3 targets on those 9 routes. So every 3 routes he was targeted. That's exciting. He caught 2 of those passes for 53 yards and a touchdown. I'm not a big film scout, but I can confidently say that streaking downfield, beating your defender downfield, and then having to turn a full 360 to adjust and make the catch in the end zone for the touchdown is not something that every NFL wide receiver can do. That was exciting to me. I think he's going to have more than 9 routes this next week. What should the expected timeline be for his usage? Because I don't think we can start him next week, but what would you want to see out of him next week to then go, okay, we are now starting him for week 8?
I'm hoping his playing time trends kind of like Wan'Dale Robinson's did, where game one, okay, good usage on a very limited amount of playing time. Next week, a big bump in snaps. See it stabilize the following week, and then we can start thinking about playing him.
Yeah, I think with Jameson Williams, I don't think I'd go above 10 to 15% of my fab, simply because we're probably going to have to play the waiting game at the very least. And I still think there's a good chance he'll always be behind not just Amon-Ra, but Sam Laporta in terms of number of targets per game. So he still feels like a guy where you're very excited if he's on your best ball teams to see what happens. But I still have a little bit of a tough time seeing how he's not going to be slightly lower volume Will Fuller for at least the rest of this year. So I see the potential, but I think he's definitely a risky pickup at the same time. I'd say a less risky pickup, though, would be Kareem Hunt. Post bye week, Kareem Hunt had 12 carries to Jerome Ford 17. He ran 12 routes to Ford's 13. So forcing a pretty tight committee after it was pretty clear that Ford was way ahead of him. And I think there's a chance he can just continue to take more and more work from Jerome Ford. Potentially the reason they committed to Ford over Hunt this offseason was simply financial. I don't think we've seen anything out of Jerome Ford to think that he's got a stranglehold on the job. And I think at least what's good for not just Hunt, but I guess it's good for Ford too, is that Pure Strong was relegated to a special teams only role in week 6. So it's good if we can only have 2 backs getting touches in this offense. It's a very, very good offensive line. And at this point, I don't actually know who I prefer rest of season between Ford and Hunt.
Yeah, let me put it to you this way, Josh. We have to make decisions on partial information in a lot of situations in fantasy or betting. And in this one, if the Browns wanted Hunt, they would have kept him. It's a pretty logical line of thinking coming into this situation. But especially last week, I think Hunt's a better player. I'm not sure why. It must have been financially driven, like you said. I'm not sure why they went in the season with Ford as their backup and not Hunt from what I've seen so far. Hunt's the guy I'm targeting in the vast majority of my teams this week.
Yeah, I'd be hoping to get him for about 10%. I think you can go up to 15 to 20 if you desperately need a running back, but I think you can probably get him for 10 simply because he had fewer carries than Jerome Ford and fewer rushing yards. Last top ad at the running back and receiver position would be Rashid Shaheed. Shaheed opened week 1, 21 fantasy points. Then he had 10 fantasy points. Then Derek Carr hurts his shoulder in week 3, and weeks 4 and 5 are not good either for the Jameis Winston experiment / Derek Carr getting rushed back too soon because of the bad Jameis Winston experience. So in weeks 3, 4, and 5, he had 0, 6, and then 5 fantasy points. Week 6, Derek Carr's shoulder looks healthy again. He leads all quarterbacks in air yards. He threw over 500 air yards this past week, and Shaheed had 18 fantasy points. If we look at the 3 weeks where we have Shaheed with a healthy Carr, his expected fantasy points in my model is 12, the same as Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith for usage. So I think there's at least some path to potential here where we can kind of overlook those 3 rough performances, given that a player like Shaheed really, really needs a healthy, strong-armed quarterback, and looks like he's got that once again with Derek Carr, who's healthy. And I wouldn't say like the strongest arm, but Carr throws a decent deep ball. Anything else you'd like to add here for the Saints speedster?
I think this actually applies a bit to Jameson Williams. I think what we're looking for here in a best case scenario is that Shaheed kind of mimics Henry Ruggs for Derek Carr before Ruggs' awful off field situation, where a good game for him is five receptions for 70 or so yards, but he has that 100 and a touchdown spike week off a 50-yard reception. I think that's what we're hoping for with Shaheed here. Not as confident as I would be with Ruggs, obviously, because Ruggs was I think the 12th overall pick, but that's, Carr's made this happen with a guy like this before.
Let's talk about tight ends. We have 3 interesting options. First is Luke Musgrave, coming off the week 6 bye for the Packers, and he's gifted the Denver Broncos defense. The past 2 healthy games that Musgrave's played in, he's had at least 7 targets. I'm removing the one game where he was concussed very early and didn't really play much. I think we're allowed to do that. Ultimately, rookies generally get better as the season goes along. He's got a premier matchup. This is my preferred streamer for week 7. Anything to add here on what you've seen out of the Broncos covering tight ends?
Yeah, if you're going to grab Musgrave, you got to do it now because Vance Joseph just doesn't believe in game planning for tight ends. So this is probably the best matchup Musgrave will have all year.
Next is Michael Mayer. of the Raiders. He ran 22 routes this past week to Austin Hooper's 9. He caught 5 of 6 targets. Those 6 targets were a 19% target share. Those 5 receptions went for 75 yards. 2 of his 6 targets came in the red zone. That's all very exciting. You might be like, well, should he be ahead of Musgrave? No, Brian Hoyer is probably his quarterback. Jimmy Garoppolo has a back injury. It's a little bit uncertain how much time he'll miss. I don't think he plays this week. So Michael Mayer, interesting rest of season bet. He will pop up for the first time on my rest of season rankings and trade value chart this week. I think we've seen enough that he deserves to be there. Not too much else to add there, but I would definitely rather start someone like a Musgrave than a Mayer for week 7.
Well, Mayer's situation right now reminds me of Pat Fryermuth's his rookie year, where he's suddenly creeping in a tight end relevancy area. Again, the quarterback situation, similar to Fryermuth years ago, is a little dicey. Brian Hoyer's actually not that bad. Obviously, he doesn't. This isn't very exciting, but a bad quarterback's best friend can be a tight end. So I don't want to start Mayer right now. But if I'm in a situation where I don't have someone that I really find reliable, I'm interested in stashing Mayer personally.
Speaking of Pat Fryermuth, he's been disappointing so far this year. It seems likely, though, that he does return week 7 from the hamstring injury he suffered back in, I believe it was week 4. And these next 2 weeks, he's going to face the Rams, 3rd best matchup for fantasy points to tight ends, and then the Jaguars, the 8th best matchup for fantasy points to tight ends. We know that Fryermuth has a target earning pedigree from past years. It hasn't happened this year. Deontay Johnson also might return, but we generally like to bet on talented players. Pat Fryermuth is still a talented player, and I think he might be borderline free, given that he hasn't done anything this year. I think you can probably get him for like 2% on waivers in most leagues, and I don't think he's the absolute worst start for these next 2 weeks if he returns. Anything to add here with Fryermuth? I think it's unsexy, but it back end top 12 potential.
Yeah, I agree with that. I really like the player. I don't have a ton of confidence in the volatile offense. I think there's at least a path to it getting better. The early season schedule was tough. They're coming off their bye now, but as long as Canada's calling the plays, it's we're not really thrilled with the situation in Pittsburgh.
Guys, reminder, Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. All his work is free on the 33rdteam.com. So is mine. If you want fantasy rankings, rest of season rankings, trade value chart, power rankings, picks and predictions for every single game, what Ryan is actually betting on, all this type of content is free on the 33rdteam.com. You need to be checking it out. If you want more waivers content, our guy Nick Bodiford has an awesome waiver column that he releases on Mondays on the site and then edits through Tuesday as well. That is already up there for his week 7 waiver targets. Some similar names to what we're talking about, a few different ones. Nick will see things a little differently than us. I think it's always good to get multiple perspectives when possible, especially in these ambiguous situations. Let's talk about some quarterback streamers. This is a doomsday week for quarterback. I'm going to pull up my fantasy rankings. I'll hit the site later today. I was telling you pre-show, I have Jordan Love against Denver as my quarterback 8. Brock Purdy against the Vikings as my quarterback 9. Geno Smith against the Cardinals as my quarterback 10. And the cliff hits. And believe it or not, quarterback 11, you'll have to see. Not very exciting. Quarterback 12 is actually Derek Carr right now against Jacksonville on Thursday night. Jacksonville isn't a particularly great pass defense. As I mentioned earlier in the show, Derek Carr's shoulders have been healthy again. The fantasy points have not been there for Derek Carr. They have not been there. But his touchdown rate this year has been 2.5%. Previously in his career, it was 4.5%. So like with Stafford, where we talked about him a couple weeks ago, and I said, I think more passing touchdowns are in store for him. More passing touchdowns are probably in store for Derek Carr as well. There's not some massive ceiling here, but I think he can give you at least 15 fantasy points, maybe 18 to 20. And this week especially, that is going to be so needed. I'd say the one thing that might cause him to drop a bit is if we get more concerning news with the Trevor Lawrence knee injury, some kind of knee sprain. If CJ Beathard is across from him in that Thursday night game, I can see the Saints leaning on the run. Training clock would be less interested. Carr maybe falls to quarterback 15, 16. But if we get Lawrence, I think Carr is not the worst streamer for this week.
Yeah, he's had 300 yards passing a couple times already this year. So I think there's let me put it this way to you, Josh. The Saints offense has accumulated significant yards a few times, but they haven't scored. Like last week, for instance, they stalled out in 2 red zone drives where they went for it on 4th and failed.
Mhm.
So I think there's eventually some kind of regression coming on the touchdown front for the Saints. Again, if Beathard's playing, I'm not sure if this is the week, although the Saints might have the ball for 50 minutes if Beathard's playing. But going forward too with Carr, which is kind of interesting, especially if you're in a really deep league. The Saints only play 3 teams with a winning record going forward, and one of them is going to be the Jaguars this week. So schedule's nice. Carr has some pretty good upside here, and a little bit going forward even.
I like to hear it. Let's talk about Kenny Pickett. He gets the Rams this week. Decent chance he gets Deontay Johnson back, Pat Freiermuth back. If so, I think there's potential for the Steelers offense to at least be respectable coming off their bye. Pickett has just a little bit of mobility. I don't think it's anything special here, but I think he gets to re-enter the streaming conversation while getting his weapons back. Anything else to add here about this matchup?
No, I mean, again, the volatile offense is a little scary, but I can say this. I expect that the Steelers will be in my ATS pools this week, so I think Pittsburgh wins this game and probably comes through the air.
All right, we're going deep. Tyrod Taylor does get the Commanders. In Daniel Jones's absence, he completed 67% of his passes for 200 yards. He did not throw a pick against the Bills. He also ran 5 times for 24 yards, despite being in his 30s. It's clear that he's still one of the more athletic quarterbacks out there. Quarterbacks against Washington the past 5 weeks have averaged 24 fantasy points. I still have that Justin Fields game ingrained in my memory when they decided they just didn't want to cover anybody at any point. Felt like we were watching the Broncos defense in that one. I'll be transparent. I have him as my quarterback 20 this week. So it's not like I am super excited to stream him, but I think there's some kind of floor here, given that Tyrod runs and given this matchup. You watched him against the Bills. Did you come away impressed at any point?
Yeah, I mean, I've said this a few times now. Tyrod Taylor is a more decisive passer than Daniel Jones. That doesn't mean he's better than Daniel Jones necessarily, but given the state of the Giants' offensive line, him being willing to get the ball out, especially downfield, quick, is a positive for the Giants. And like you said, he's going to have some rushing equity. It's ugly. It's disgusting. You don't want to play Tyrod Taylor unless you absolutely have to, but if you're desperate, he's in a decent spot here.
Now, guys, we have one of the grossest weeks yet in terms of real football. So many injuries to quarterbacks, bad matchups, low game totals. And we're going to do something special this week. We're going to close the show with a rapid fire defense streamer conversation because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 defenses that are probably going to be out on waivers in most leagues that you can stream this week. And before we close the show with that rapid fire segment, which I know I'm looking forward to, reminder to check out everything that we do on the 33rdteam.com. This podcast, if you're listening live and want the audio version for your commutes, or just want any of our other podcasts that we do for your commutes, our Monday and Thursday fantasy and betting show. If you want this Tuesday waiver show, if you want the player prop happy hour that we do on Fridays, if you want Ben Wolby and Alex Caruso's show that they do on Wednesdays, if you want Jordan Vanek and Hilo show that they do for DFS on Friday nights, all those shows are in the 33rd Team Podcast Network. You can search that on Apple and Spotify, and you can also check us out on the Fantasy and Betting YouTube for the 33rd Team. Ryan, it's time. I will be giving you the matchup, and I want your thoughts. We're going to go extremely rapid fire. Let's get the people out of here on a fun note. The Giants host the Washington Commanders.
Sam Howell's taking sacks at a historic rate. The Giants have played the Dolphins, the Bills, the 49ers, the Cowboys. Pretty tough competition so far. The defense has been playing better the last couple of weeks. I think they're a pretty strong matchup against the Commanders, especially since they're kind of in desperation mode for a win.
The Seattle Seahawks host the Arizona Cardinals.
The last 2 weeks, the Cardinals have been the team we expected going into the offseason. They've kind of lost decisively in both contests. The Seahawks, kind of a revenge spot, not a revenge spot, but a bounce back spot for here against an inferior team. Pretty 8.5-point favorites. I'm interested in Seattle.
The Tampa Bay Buccaneers host the Atlanta Falcons.
Obviously this is a bet against a good defense against Desmond Ridder. The offensive line situation for the Falcons is a positive in this matchup, so that gives me a little, I like them less than both Seattle and the Giants.
On the opposite side, the Falcons travel to face Baker Mayfield and the Buccaneers.
Feel the same way about it. There's a number of games every week where you're like, okay, which side of the coin do I want here? The positive for the Falcons side here is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have a worse offensive line, and you also get the bet against Baker Mayfield.
The Chicago Bears host the Las Vegas Raiders.
I think I'm going to pass on this one just because the Bears don't have a super competitive front, but you're betting against Brian Hoyer here, so at least has to be on your radar.
Let's flip the script. The Raiders travel to Soldier Field to face the Bears.
Max Crosby against Mr. Badgett. We're not even going to say his first name, is a pretty appealing option this week. If you're looking for upside, the Raiders, honestly, they're right there with the Giants in terms of upside as a defensive unit.
Let's end the show. The Packers host the Denver Broncos.
If we get the Russell Wilson we got on Thursday night against the Chiefs, the Packers might actually be the best option out of this group. They're coming off a bye, premium front, excellent players at all levels. Kind of, again, high upside matchup. It would be between the Raiders or the Packers for me in a lot of situations.